Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Nice to see all my colleagues out on a cloudy Victoria day. Thanks for joining us. There was a significant announcement this morning from the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta, and I'm happy for the opportunity to join you to respond to that agreement. First of all, I'd like to start with where British Columbia is at right now in terms of our efforts to build the national economy, to create jobs and prosperity for Canadians and for British Columbians. We have huge projects, really exciting projects in our province right now that will employ thousands of people, create billions of dollars in revenue for the federal and provincial governments to help pay for the public services that people need, and that are done in a way that is environmentally responsible and that is done in partnership with First Nations. This approach, which we have been working on for years, is why we are leading the country in major projects in the Federal Major Projects Office. We have 4 times more projects than any other province in Canada. These are private sector projects with billions of dollars of investment in Canada that will increase the buying power of Canadians who are struggling with affordability, that will employ thousands of people from across the country in good paying jobs supporting families, and that will do so reducing our reliance on the United States. These projects involve exports to global markets across the Pacific. We're really proud of that, and the core of this work, the foundation of it, is the support of British Columbians, Canadians, and particularly First Nations to be able to work together to lift the whole country up. With the announcement today from the federal government and from the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta, my anxiety about the pipeline proposal that has come from Alberta, that is a key part of this agreement, is that it runs the very significant risk that has already partially been realized of taking our eye off the prize, of distracting the federal government, distracting resources, and pulling time away from real projects that can be delivered in the near term. And just one example, we have the largest private sector investment in Canadian history that will reach final investment decision in the next year, the LNG Canada Phase 2 project. We need the federal government focused on that. We need them focused on the $50 billion in mining projects in the Northwest enabled by the North Coast Transmission Line. These are projects that are imminently getting their permits or already have all relevant approvals. They have private sector backers, and they are ready to go. The reason why I'm anxious about this proposed pipeline project from Alberta being a distraction is that we've already seen that happen. Nutrien, a large potash producer from Saskatchewan, was involved in conversations with the federal government, with the government of Saskatchewan, about where to export their potash from. A project that would result in significant jobs in British Columbia, would secure the people of Saskatchewan's access to global markets if it stayed in Canada, and would also reduce the risk of Donald Trump putting tariffs on Canadian potash going through the United States. They were making a decision about which port to export through. Unfortunately, instead of having conversations with British Columbia about this project, the Premier of Saskatchewan says he was engaged with Premier Smith about this pipeline project proposal. Because of that, in my opinion, Nutrien made the decision to ship out of Washington State instead of out of British Columbia. Premier Moe and I should have been working together on addressing bottlenecks by encouraging the federal government to invest in new rail infrastructure, the Massey Tunnel, bottlenecks to our ports that Nutrien cited as one of the reasons why they decided to go to Washington State. So my concern about this project being a distraction to real projects and real opportunities for Canadians, unfortunately, I've seen that happen once already, and I don't want to see it happen again. The pipeline proposal has no project proponent. There is not one private company that has stepped up to say, if you build it, we'll buy it. If the approvals are in place, we'll build it. Not one. It has no route. Currently, taxpayers, through the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation, are funding the development of the route. Not only does it not have permits, it doesn't even have a route. But the third thing it doesn't have is something that the Prime Minister said he believed was core in the House, in the federal Parliament just recently, that First Nations agree and support projects before they will go forward through the Major Projects Office. And this project does not have the support of coastal First Nations. And that's important to us in BC because all of the projects that I outlined to you, those billions of dollars of investment, those thousands of jobs, depend as well on the support of coastal First Nations, whose support we do have for these projects. There are significant additional components to this agreement that British Columbia will need to take some time to study and understand. There is a marked departure in federal government policy around oil and gas cap, emissions cap, around clean electricity regulations and other pieces that we'll have to study to understand. But the bottom line for us is that we need to make sure that this project doesn't become an energy vampire with all of the variables that have yet to be fulfilled. No proponent, no route, no money, no First Nation support, that it cannot draw limited federal resources, limited Indigenous governance resources, limited provincial resources away from the real projects that will employ people, provide the country with money that we desperately need, and provide investment and access to global markets to deepen our trade relationships overseas. So I will continue to advocate for British Columbia's interests, which I believe are also Canadian interests, in delivering as many projects as we can, as quickly as possible, to grow our economy and support people across the country. I'm proud of the fact that BC is the economic engine of the new economy that we're building together as Canadians, and we will continue to play our role. And all I ask is that every project across the country be evaluated against the same criteria. Do you have permits? Do you have a private project proponent? How much money is it going to bring in? How much are you going to raise wages and GDP for Canadians? And on those criteria, BC, far and away, leads the country. We will continue to do so, and we're proud to do so. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today at the Legislature in Victoria. We're going to take questions from the media now. All members of the media will have one question and one follow-up. And today we're going to start with Keith Baldry from Global News.
Hi, Premier. Is today a day of embarrassment for British Columbia, given that two other governments meeting in secret, concocting a scheme to implement something in this province that this government is on record as being vehemently against? And what does that say about BC's place in Confederation?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. You know, I'm incredibly proud of what our province is doing for not just British Columbians, but for Canadians in lifting our gross domestic product, in creating revenues that are going to support all Canadians through the public services that they deserve, leading the country in this work. I understand the need for the Prime Minister to engage with premiers, to reach agreements with them, and I don't fault him for engaging with Alberta on this. It would have been good for BC to be at the table. There's no question about it. Had BC been at the table, the agreement wouldn't have omitted basic things like, are we going to do anything about spill response? Or we would have canvassed potential win-win scenarios of asking, if we're going to start from scratch on a new project for the country, why aren't we talking about refining capacity? Why aren't we talking about using Alberta's oil and gas to ensure that Canada is independent of any oil and gas imports, that we only use Canadian oil and gas? In British Columbia, our philosophy is for our resources, we're trying to get as many jobs as possible out of those resources before they go to global markets. We too often sell our resources wholesale and buy them back retail. And that would have been one of the conversations I would have raised at the table. Why is British Columbia importing oil and gas from the United States? Why is Ontario doing that? When we have these resources here, could we increase refining capacity and have a win for everybody here? I think there are wins for everybody. But that can't happen if we're not all at the table together.
And Keith, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, so as you say, there's no proponent, there's no plan, there's no route, really nothing there. Today the Prime Minister said if there's no proponent, there's no pipeline, period, full stop. Do you interpret that to mean that there's not going to be any federal subsidy as we saw with the TMX pipeline, and therefore the odds of this pipeline being built are rather remote?
I think this proposal has some major challenges. First of all, we already have a publicly owned pipeline. It is not at capacity. It is for sale. Nobody wants to buy it. For this new pipeline proposal, it similarly has no company that has stepped up and said, even under the most optimistic conditions, that they would be interested in building it, that if it were already built, that they would be interested in buying it, which leaves only one possible way that it could get built, which is through a massive taxpayer-funded support in the order of $30 to $40 billion of taxpayer dollars to get it built. Now, in that scenario, I think British Columbia has some projects that could compete with this one that would create just as much opportunity and be significantly cheaper to taxpayers. But we're not even asking for taxpayer dollars. I don't think one taxpayer dollar should go into this project, and I'm glad to see in the agreement that that is a condition. And I think that that is probably fatal to Premier Smith's proposal. I understand the Prime Minister was speaking to the Calgary Board of Trade and jokingly asked if anyone wanted to be a proponent of the project. Joking aside, there is no proponent. There is unlikely to be a proponent. And so even if there were a proponent, one of the key hurdles of coastal First Nations support has not been achieved. And it has been their position since 1977 that the oil tanker ban needs to be in place, because if there were an oil spill, their way of life would end, as would $1.7 billion in economic activity on the coast.
Thanks, Premier. Next, we'll head to Katie DeRosa, CBC.
Premier, have you talked to the Prime Minister since that initial phone call on Monday when, just hours later after he told you it was not finalized, we found out the broad strokes were finalized? So can you explain how you feel about being left out in the dark when you talked to him on Monday? And so what has been the conversation since then?
Yes, I spoke with the Prime Minister yesterday. He outlined for me the broad pieces of the agreement so that I was aware of it. I had asked him in our previous call to underline the importance of First Nations support for this project and British Columbia's support for this project as conditions of the project approval. He stood in the House the next day and made it clear that that was his position. He said this project and projects generally through the Major Projects Office should not proceed without the agreement and support of First Nations. So I'm glad that he listened carefully during our conversation. I'm glad that's his position. And I will happily, and at the request of Coastal First Nations, invite the Prime Minister to take the next obvious step, which is to sit down with Coastal First Nations and talk with them about his proposal that he's advancing with Alberta.
And follow-up, Katie?
John Rustad said earlier today that either you're on Team Canada or you're on Team Trump, alluding to the fact that this would allow Canada to continue to sell its oil to U.S. markets at a discount. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I continue to be surprised that we're not having a conversation about selling our oil to Canadians, that we're not talking about adding refinery capacity. I think that's an important conversation that we could be having, and unfortunately we're not having. But I will say for the Conservatives in British Columbia, when Trump started attacking our economy, their first instinct was to stand with Trump. When now fictional, non-existent, unfunded project from Alberta threatens First Nation support for thousands of jobs and prosperity for families in British Columbia and for Canada, Mr. Rustad is standing with Alberta. What will it take for the Conservatives to stand with British Columbians? What will it take for him to support actual projects here in this province that will lift up everybody across the country? I don't understand his strategy, but I can say for my part, for my colleagues behind me, we're going to stand up for British Columbians and for Canadians, for real projects that will be delivered, and I am really excited about what we're doing here and what it will create for this country.
Next, we'll head to Rob Buffum from CTV.
Well, hi, Premier. Danielle Smith said today that BC does not have a veto on this pipeline going ahead when she was asked about what role BC could play in this. I want to get your reaction to that And she also said that she spoke to you last night. I'm curious if you could, give us the gist of what your message to her was regarding BC's position on this pipeline.
Yeah, thanks. I think the proposed project from Premier Smith faces some pretty major hurdles. She doesn't have a private company that has any interest in this. There's no private money at all that's come forward. I understand that's a condition of going forward. The First Nations, who the Prime Minister says their support and approval is needed in order for this project to go ahead, are adamantly opposed. And I encourage the Prime Minister to sit down with Coastal First Nations to canvass that. When I spoke to Premier Smith, I said very clearly, I'm always happy to sit down with you to explain our position on this proposal, to find areas where British Columbia and Alberta can cooperate. But I will always defend BC's interests, and defending BC's interests includes defending the oil tanker ban that has been there through multiple generations of politicians and political parties for good reason. An oil tanker spill would decimate a way of life for people in the northwest of our province. And there's a whole bunch of other things that we could work on together that would lift up people in Alberta and in BC, and I'm glad to engage on that.
And follow-up, Rob?
Yeah, I just wanted to get your reaction. You must have watched some of the things today, seeing the Prime Minister and Premier Smith signing that MOU, almost giddy, big smiles on their faces. What are your thoughts when you watch that and know that you haven't even been consulted, and Coastal First Nations say they have not at all been consulted? And as a addendum, I guess I'm wondering, is there any world in which this government, the NDP government here in BC, ultimately does agree to a pipeline and a tanker ban being lifted?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think for the Prime Minister, I understand he's got to work with provinces, he's got to come to agreements. I think that continued friction and antagonism between Ottawa and Alberta is not helpful, and I'm glad that they were able to sit down and do that work. The part where I'm challenged and where I really have to draw the line is that there are limited federal resources, whether it's money or time or bureaucrats to work on things. And we have one goal, in my opinion, in this country, and that should be to diversify our markets, to get real projects delivered that are going to employ people, that are going to give them good paying jobs, going to raise the GDP, going to grow the economy, going to help us pay for public services, and all of those other good things. And if you apply that lens to this pipeline project, it is not even in the top 20. There is no project proponent, there is no route, there is no First Nation support for it. It will not employ anybody because it does not exist. And yet, it's coming at the expense of very real projects in British Columbia that I am standing up for, and I will deliver, and the team behind me is going to deliver for British Columbians and for all Canadians. I hope for, and I think Canada deserves, better relations between Alberta and Ottawa. I hope for the same for British Columbia and Ottawa. I continue to advocate for our province with Ottawa for more attention, more support for what we're delivering to help the Prime Minister achieve our shared goal of lifting up the quality of life of all Canadians in a time of an affordability crisis.
So we'll head to Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail.
Hi, Premier. Both Prime Minister Carney and Premier Smith said that they would immediately engage with BC to talk about how to implement this MOU. What does that three-way discussion look like? What are you going to be doing?
I had conversations with both the Prime Minister and Premier Smith yesterday, and my message to them was consistent. The first step, in my opinion, that has to happen is that the Prime Minister needs to sit down with Coastal First Nations. They need to be a part of this conversation. They are the cornerstone of billions of dollars of investment in our province, thousands of jobs that are going to go forward, and they need to be engaged. The other piece that I offered, I said very clearly to the Prime Minister and to Premier Smith, I am always glad to sit down with you to defend BC's interests and to support this country and find things that we can work on together. But the position of this government is very clear. The oil tanker ban off the North Coast is the foundation of $1.7 billion in economic activity, thousands of jobs. Today, at the legislature, we have seafood producers who are visiting, people who spend their lives out on the ocean, who depend on the clean waters off our coast to put the seafood on your plate across the country, who are terrified of an oil tanker spill destroying their way of life. That is just one group, never mind the tourism or any of the other impacts that this would have. So our position is very clear on this, but I'm happy to try to find ways that we can work together. Let's talk about refining capacity. Let's talk about the existing TMX pipeline and what we can do together on that. Let's talk about electrical interties. Let's find that way to move forward together.
Do you have a follow-up for the Premier, Justine?
I do. You mentioned the MOU doesn't discuss spill response. I'm also wondering if you've had a chance to look and see where in the MOU there is some kind of assurance that BC and First Nations will have to agree before this pipeline goes forward. I know the Prime Minister said it in the House. Is it in the MOU?
I looked very carefully at the MOU to determine what consideration had been given to British Columbia's interests in this, to Coastal First Nations' interests in this, and the agreement is silent on both of those issues. I look forward to the Prime Minister making good on his commitment to Coastal First Nations in particular, that they will be at the table, that, as he said in the House, that their consent and support is needed for this project to advance, because that is the cornerstone for British Columbia for our economic initiatives, and in my opinion, it is the condition that has to be met in order for any proposed pipeline to go forward.
Next, we'll head to Wolf Deppner from the Canadian Press.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Thanks for taking my question. Premier, you've called this proposed pipeline a distraction. You called it an energy vampire. And you, if I remember you correctly, saying just now that you've seen this before and you don't want to see this again. I can only read that comment to be a sort of an allusion to the TMX debate. Can Canada read that as a sort of a veiled threat that BC might launch a legal challenge against this project? Thank you.
No, we don't. Wolf, we don't have to threaten legal action to stop a project or anything. And to be blunt, we've done that already with the TMX project. We lost in court. It's very clear. We understand that if the federal government wished, they could impose this pipeline on us. That's not what this is about. What this is about is the fact that this project has no company that's advancing it. It's got no money. It's got no Coastal First Nation support. And it is threatening that Coastal First Nation support for other major projects that actually have all their permits, major companies advancing them, thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in economic activity, really exciting nation-building projects that we are going to deliver. But we require a federal government that keeps its eye on the ball and helps us deliver those projects and does not get distracted by this project that, on the most optimistic take, is a decade behind where these other projects are. And so when I ask for the federal government's attention to British Columbia, to the projects we're advancing, it is because I believe that these projects will lift the whole country up, will increase the buying power of Canadians, will support Canadians with good, high-quality jobs, and that's what we're focused on here in BC.
Follow-up, sir?
Yes, thank you. You already mentioned First Nations, Coastal First Nations have come out against the proposal on multiple occasions, again today several times. What, if any, legal support would your government offer them in case they were to launch a challenge? Thank you.
Yeah, the Coastal First Nations are well accustomed to this conversation. The Chief Slet had a meeting with her yesterday as well, and she pointed out that in 1977 there were public hearings about heavy oil shipments through the coast of BC, and in 1977 the Coastal First Nations, the Healthsick First Nations chief was speaking out, raising concern, saying that, and the famous quote is, "one oil spill and we're finished." And so Coastal First Nations are well and capable of standing up on their own. To assert their own rights. They've been doing it for a long time. They will continue to do that. And I am so glad to have their support and tolerance, in some cases, of the billions of dollars in real projects that we are advancing. And I just encourage the Prime Minister to sit down directly with them to understand why it is that we are so anxious that a project that on the most optimistic take is so far away and such a long shot compared to the real projects we're delivering, why we're so anxious that that project would put the real projects in British Columbia at risk, and what the concerns are of the Coastal First Nations.
So we'll head to Alec Lazenby from the Vancouver Sun.
Hi, Premier. On multiple occasions, you said that this pipeline project, if in some world it did go ahead, would put billions of dollars of projects at risk. You mentioned LNG Canada Phase 2 today. At other points, you mentioned Silas Sims and the North Coast Transmission Line. I'm just wondering, in terms of your conversations with First Nations, exactly which First Nations might withdraw their support from these projects. I know the coastal First Nations are already opposed to many of the LNG projects in the province. Just wondering if you could provide some specifics of what First Nations could switch their support for certain projects if this pipeline were to go ahead.
Thanks. When you're talking about expansion of the Port of Prince Rupert, we have billions of dollars of projects underway and proposed for that port, or about the LNG projects, or you're talking about the North Coast Transmission Line, which will enable $50 billion in economic activity through the construction of new mines, as well as enabling exports through the port out of Stewart, which is owned by 2 First Nations. It's hard to understate the degree to which British Columbia is partnered with and working together with First Nations on delivering prosperity for all Canadians and for British Columbians. In terms of the specific proposal of the pipeline project, it's the coastal First Nations that led the pushback against the Northern Gateway proposal when it existed, that are outspoken and concerned about this. But I note that the Haisla First Nation, and this is a First Nation that delivered the Cedar, is delivering right now, the Cedar LNG project. This is a nation that is supportive of economic development and understands finding that balance, issued a statement opposing this pipeline project. And so when you have nations that are supporting economic development, or at least tolerating an increase in shipping through this area, being excluded from conversations, that is a problem. And I am glad that the Prime Minister has made it clear that coastal First Nations support for this project and consent for it is a requirement to go forward.
And Alec, do you have a follow-up?
Just back to your conversation with Prime Minister Carney yesterday, just wondering if he provided any rationale to you, I guess, for why BC wasn't included in the negotiations and the talks over the last number of weeks and months, and what the conversation was like in terms of what you told him about, I guess your disappointment that you weren't included in those talks.
Yeah, I certainly have expressed to the Prime Minister that it is my opinion that the talks would have been more productive, and at a minimum, there would have been a clearer understanding of the points of difference and the points of agreement had British Columbia been at the table. But also, the reality is that British Columbia is focused on delivering a portfolio of projects that are reaching final investment decision over the next couple of years that are going to significantly improve the Canadian economy. And we have limited bandwidth here in British Columbia. The federal government has limited bandwidth. And our focus is on projects that we can actually deliver that are going to go ahead. And spending an extended amount of time on a project that has none of the pieces that BC projects have, whether it's private backing, a company advancing it, permits in place, a route. I mean, that's not British Columbia's priority. Our priority is on delivering for families here and across the country in terms of real economic development, and that will continue to be our focus.
Next question, Rob Shaw, Check News.
You don't seem very angry. And I've noticed in the past, talking to you about pipelines, you've had kind of, good lines, kind of attacks at the federal government for doing this. It seems very muted today, your response. I'm wondering if you're changing the way you're talking about this to sort of be resigned to the fact that it's happening.
Well, I think about it this way, Rob, and you're right. I'm not angry today. I look at Danielle Smith, and I see a premier of Alberta that she has a political imperative for her political party that she needs to meet. And am I going to be upset with Danielle Smith for advancing what the United Conservative Party wants her to do? I understand that. The Prime Minister needs to de-escalate with Alberta and find a path forward. I understand that. The part where I'm going to get my elbows up, to borrow a phrase, is when this conversation about this non-existent project begins to actively compromise projects here in British Columbia that are real and meaningful and will actually make a difference in British Columbia for people who live here, for our government's finances, for federal government finances, and so on. And it really pissed me off that we lost the Nutrien deal, because I think that was entirely avoidable. And that is the one that gets under my skin. That is the one that makes me really unhappy. We cannot afford as a country or as a province to lose real projects in the name of politics right now. We need every possible project delivered. And so my commitment to the Prime Minister, my commitment to Scott Moe, should I hear from him, is that we will work with them. I spoke with the Transportation Minister yesterday at the federal government level to say we will work with them to do our best to reverse that decision of shipping potash out of Washington State instead of British Columbia. We have to address the bottlenecks to our ports. We cannot get distracted anymore by this notional project and have it cost us real projects. And so this MOU is not a project. We should not get confused that an MOU is a project. Let's stay focused. Let's keep our eyes on the prize and deliver real projects for British Columbians and Canadians.
And Rob, do you have a follow-up for the Premier?
That was better. Yeah. Are you going to come up with like a list that is of sort of requirements that this project has to meet in order to gather some sort of acceptance from the BC government, world-class oil spill response, X amount of economic benefits? Like, is there going to be a very clear list from British Columbia, or are you just going to sort of continue to say that it just, on any circumstances, doesn't meet what you want to see?
So for my part, my list has one item on it right now. That's that the federal government, that the Prime Minister sit down with the coastal First Nations and see and understand where this project stands and what has to happen to get coastal First Nations support. And the reason why that is so central to me is because the coastal First Nation support for so many other projects in British Columbia is the cornerstone of prosperity for our province, the federal government, for British Columbians and Canadians going forward. So right now the list is just one item, and that is my request to the Prime Minister, and I hope he will take me up on it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. That concludes today's event.